Hi, everyone. We're going to get this started. Bear with me. We're going to get this rolling here. We're excited to have so many folks joining us today. All right. Wonderful. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first Racial Justice 101 panel. It's put on by the Greater Fairbanks NAACP Anti-Racism and Sensitivity Training Work Group. I want to make sure everyone can hear me. Are we good on the panel? You all can hear me there? Everyone's good? Okay, wonderful. Before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that I and many of us attending this panel are on the unceded traditional lands of the Lower Tanana Dene people. We honor the continued fight for the rights of our First Peoples, and we stand with them in solidarity and in action. If you're joining us from somewhere further away, I would encourage you to take the time to learn and reflect about what land you're on. A great place to look at that is the Native Land Project, and it's going to tell you more about whose land you're on. And you can find that at native-land.ca. Thank you to our collaborators at the Nanook Diversity and Action Center, and thank you to the NAACP's Anti-Racism and Sensitivity Training Work Group. My name is Will. My pronouns are he and him. I am actually part of the Anti-Racism and Sensitivity Training Work Group, and I'm so excited to share a wonderful panel with you today to open a conversation here in Fairbanks, especially about racial justice. What does it mean? Where does the need of it come from? And what can we do in our community and in the world to begin working towards racial justice? I'm excited to introduce you to the three individuals who will be discussing these questions and a lot more tonight. I'm going to start with Alyssa Quintin. She uses she, her pronouns. If you get the chance to, or if you got the chance to read her full bio in our slideshow, you will see that, like all of our panelists tonight, Alyssa is dedicated and busy. She has been working in the community, organizing around energy issues, around voter engagement, around gender inclusive facilities at UAF. She's worked on campaigns. She's curated art for the Black Alaskan Art Matters exhibit through Perseverance Theater. She's delved deep into research around discrimination and civil governance, and she's currently, among many other things, I am sure, a member of the Fairbanks North Scarborough School District Diversity Committee. I'm very excited to get to hear from Alyssa. Mae Marsh uses she, her pronouns. She has studied race and equity throughout her career. She worked for many years as the director of equal employment opportunity programs at Army bases throughout Alaska. She was instrumental in creating the way that Title IX worked at UAF, and she developed the accredited university course Race and Healing for UAF, which she ran for 14 years. She was the director of diversity and equal opportunity at the university as well. She currently works with the Alaska State Vocational Rehabilitation Committee, as well as with church groups and other community organizations to continue to promote racial justice in Fairbanks and Alaska. I'm really eager to hear more from Mae. And finally, Joe Malbert Narvaez uses he or they pronouns. I've had the privilege of getting to know Joe over the last few months, working with them through the NAACP. Joe was recently sworn in. I'm not sure that's exactly the right term, but it felt fitting for today, as the youth advisor for the Greater Fairbanks NAACP chapter. And I don't think there's a better candidate for the job. Joe is dedicated to their work at Nanook Diversity and Action Center, where they serve as the diversity and inclusion coordinator. They were a founding part of the advocacy group Racial Justice for UA that strives to address systemic racial inequity in the university system in Alaska. Joe has extensive experience facilitating workshops and training that approaches racial justice through an intersectional lens. We're really lucky to have Joe with us today. I'd like to thank all of the panelists ahead of time for the time, energy, and emotional labor that goes into discussing these topics publicly. Thank you. And then last but not least, before we begin, let's talk about the technology. By now, I think we're all getting pretty used to Zoom, but in case you're new to the program, I'll point out a couple basic features. This call is set up so that only the panelists and myself can share our video or audio. But we do welcome and encourage questions. If you do have a question, you can click the little universal chat icon, which is that little speech bubble, and that will open up a chat window. you'll have 3 chat monitors on hand who will be available to receive your questions. So you can, from the drop down, you can pick any one of the 3, and you can send your question to them. It really doesn't matter which, just a way to kind of divide up some of the work of reading through all the questions that we're excited to have. And you can feel free to send a question at any time. We'll answer questions that address whatever topic is at hand if it makes sense to do so. And then any other questions that we are not able to get to, we're going to try our best to answer in the final Q&A section. If your question doesn't get answered, or if you end up having other questions, you will actually have the chance to submit whatever you want to ask at the end of the panel, along with a quick little survey that we hope is going to help us determine what the topic and ideas of the next Racial Justice 101 panel will be. And that form is also going to put you on a list so that you can be notified when we do another workshop or panel, which we hope will be sometime soon. I wanted to let you know that the panel is being recorded. You, I believe, will be given a link at the end of the session in case you would like to go over the questions or thoughts, or if you missed anything, if something cut out and you wanted to revisit it. So without further ado, let me bring us to our amazing panelists. And I think we will go ahead and dive right in. We're going to start with just defining some terms. So we're here today, Racial Justice 101. We're trying to define social justice activism, anti-racism, power, privilege, oppression, marginalization, intersectionality. And then we want to discuss how these mechanisms show up for us in society, whether that's nationally, at the state level, at a local level, at a personal level. We want to provide tips on how to practice anti-racism in our lives. And then we want to see what next steps we can do. So with our amazing and incredible panelists, I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna dive right in with the definitions. So Alyssa, if it's okay, I'd like to start with you. What is racial justice to you, and what is anti-racism?
Well, thanks, Phil, for the question. So specifically to me, what racial justice, really looks like is understanding anti-racism itself and how to apply that in socioeconomic and political means, whether you are an organizer, whether you are a elected leader. And to me, anti-racism is recognizing and centering and protecting those whose labor and collective histories are continually building our histories here in this country and our ways of being. And what that means for, especially in this country, in this community, is marginalized communities, communities of color, indigenous communities, LGBTQ communities, marginalized, communities marginalized throughout. It was our labor, our literal blood and bones in the soil that created the foundation of even Fairbanks itself. So anti-racism is prioritizing those histories and those voices while building a foundation and a system in which those voices, those people are at the forefront of decision making, that will then protect, advance, and essentially make our communities thrive and not just survive.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one thing that you had mentioned, that a lot of this work is about protecting, and I wonder, Joe, if or May, if either of you have anything that you'd like to add on to those thoughts.
Yeah. Alyssa, thank you so much for so eloquently explaining that. I think that acknowledgement is such an important thing because gaslighting is so real. I think that when we talk about racial justice, we need to acknowledge that racism is a thing, that it exists and that it is pervasive. And it has various forms of manifestation. Racism is not just limited to the very overt acts of somebody calling somebody the N-word, or or hanging a Confederate flag. It's not always that simple. It's always in the nuances and the way that policies disproportionately impact communities of color. When we talk about anti-racism, talk about something that is like active. It's day-to-day commitment to dismantle these systems that are consistently oppressing communities of color, our indigenous folks. It's also a choice, and it is something that constantly needs to be upheld. It's an uphill battle. It's something that if we're not actively engaging, then racism will flourish. So, and it's just because that's the way that our society has been structured. I always think of the paradox by Karl Popper, paradox of intolerance, or of tolerance, that in order for a society to be truly tolerant, we need to be intolerant of intolerance, which means that we need to be active in making sure that we are uplifting communities who have been marginalized in the past and not giving room to make that space unsafe for these communities to be able to, as Alyssa mentioned, thrive and not just survive. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really some excellent points, and I feel like that definitely dovetails a lot with what Liz was saying about protecting and that actionable step. Um, and May, did you have anything else you wanted to add with those definitions?
Yeah, I think I would like to add a couple of things. I'm going to come from a different perspective because I'm an old woman. I grew up in the segregated South. And so, where I'm coming from is probably going to be slightly different. Not that my end goal isn't the same. But when I think about social justice, I think about balance, that there's balance in, that's what justice is about. It's about having balance. So, what I have in my mind when I think about that is the image of the statue of Lady Justice. And so it's a woman representing female energy, wielding a sword, which represents the male energy. She's carrying a scale, and that represents that balance. And she's blindfolded, which does not mean the same as colorblind. It means that she's blindfolded, which represents impartiality. And so, when I think about that symbolically, that's the promise of our nation. That's what I grew up with as the end goal of creating that equality, creating that justice. And that's what I've worked for my entire life. It started when I was a child with a very outspoken racist father, and opposing that. And opposing that does not mean that I didn't love him. Sometimes you have to love people through it so that they can get to the other side. I don't know that this is always perpetuated in a knowing manner, but what we've been taught clouds our vision. And so when I think about racism and anti-racism, race is a category that was created to organize us socially, for generations, many, many generations going back. And it's a lie. I mean, scientists have proven now that there's no foundation for that, but yet it still prevails in our society. And it's based on physical features and attaching meaning to physical features, which you really cannot do. And so, when I think about anti-racism, it's opposing that, those categories. It's about opposing that illogical and false meaning of qualities to an individual based on their physical characteristics. It's about opposing that belief system that perpetuates that. And it's about steadily looking at and fettering out uh, in our hearts and in our minds those things that perpetuate those practices and those policies.
Yeah, that's really well put. And it's the image of the of the balance of justice, and then kind of going into what you were saying about steadily looking at what the other side of this is. We started with the question, what is racial justice and what is anti-racism? Well, the other side of that is what is oppression and also what is privilege. Joe, do you mind if I start with you, and you have any thoughts on kind of how to define those two things that maybe anti-racism and racial justice are opposing?
Yeah, and I really appreciate that question of um, asking what the definition of oppression is, and at the same time asking what privilege is, because we can't talk about one without talking about the other. Oppression is being cast aside, being actively torn down or ignored or silenced based on a certain identity that you hold. In this case today, we're talking about racial justice, but oppression exists across all types of, all sorts of identities. On the flip side, privilege is unearned access to resources, powers, and respect simply because you hold an identity. So the flip side of that. I think it's very important to recognize that we cannot have oppression without privilege, that we don't always recognize when we do hold privilege, because everything around us was designed for us to experience no difficulty in the areas that we do hold privilege. Also, that does not mean that if we hold privilege based on one identity that we don't experience oppression in other parts of our identity. And one thing that I'd like to add finally is that those who experience oppression are generally aware of their oppressions, while those of us who hold privilege then are not always conscious. Like it takes like an effort for us to really reflect on like what are areas that what are things that I don't have to think about today. For example, I don't think about whether or not I'm going to be able to walk to work or walk to my car to go to work. I have privileged ability to be able to do that. And similarly with race, it's not always easy for us to recognize when privilege is in play. But it takes an active effort for us to reflect on that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Alyssa, what are your thoughts with like kind of what is oppression and where does privilege manifest, and what does it look like, or what does it mean?
Yeah, unfortunately and unfortunately, that's sort of my favorite question or topic. It's very reminiscent. When I was doing international research, we were specifically talking about that and how that plays in civil governance. And the definitions that we came up with within that project, is exactly what Joe is saying. And the only thing I would really love to add in both oppression and privilege is that it is both systematic and intentional. So, those authority places of governance are intentionally and systematically either restricting or benefiting a particular characteristic, a particular collective group of people, specifically for a thing, specifically for a trend or what you look like or what you don't look like. And so that's the really important thing to remember, in that collectiveness is that it's both systematic and intentional. And, and that intentional and systematic comes in place of policies everywhere from, the fact that we have to have hair discrimination laws to the fight of whether not law, but loan forgiveness is seen as additional income for people with disabilities. Because once you make over a certain amount, then you're off of disability. And what does that say in terms of our governance and how we are advocating and elevating those communities? So I definitely ask people to reflect on that, that it's, yes, it's social for sure. When we feel that culturally and socially and with our friends, but it's intentional, and it's intentional for a specific reason, and that is to like May was saying, organize us as first and second, third class citizens.
Alyssa, I'm going to ask a question that you may point something at myself, but can you give me, I think I have the idea of what it is, but can you tell me what you mean when you say civil governance? It's also in your bio, and I was curious what that specifically means.
Yeah, so civil governance really is talking about the relationships and interactions between a community and its authority source. So you can think about, the borough and borough residents, the city and city residents. So it's talking about the things that we as communities can do with and within our government, and what our government can do with and to us.
Got it. That makes a ton of sense. Thank you. May, did you have any other thoughts about just the definition of oppression and privilege?
Yeah, I'm going to add a little bit to that too. When I think about oppression, I think about it's not just an intellectual practice. And that's often what we do. We intellectualize about it. But if you want to know what it feels like, think about a time when you were working for someone and it felt like you couldn't do anything right. You were constantly under pressure. Uh, that feeling of having that boss that has power over you and that you can't um, accomplish or fully participate, that's what I think about as oppression. And so I don't think it's something that we can just put into our minds. It's something that operates on an emotional level. And, when people understand the impact that it has and how it robs us all. Because if you are in a situation where you're under oppression, then you're not free to offer the God-given talents that you bring with you. And to me, that's the important role, is that if we can open up, we can't all do everything perfectly. One example that I often use is that we each come with different talents and faculties. And so one talent that I didn't get is singing. But other people have that talent. And when I can allow that environment where they can make the contribution that comes very natural to them, that's when we enter that state or that environment where we all collaboratively offer our best, our talents, our faculties.
Yeah, that so you had mentioned like the feeling of being it sounds like in a lot of ways restricted, and I think that actually makes a lot of sense with what Alyssa said about civil governance, because it's that relationship between not only ourselves and the bodies that govern us. But one thing that came up with a lot of your answers is the various ways in which people can be oppressed, and the fact that it's not just one thing. And I think that kind of leads us into this other term, which is intersectionality. And I know that all of you have mentioned intersectionality in some way or another in your bios and in your other work. I'm wondering, May, do you want to talk about like your experience with what intersectionality is to you, and like some examples that you may see?
Well, that that one's probably a tough one for me, because I think that to me, intersectionality is this framework, and it attempts to socially and politically identify an individual. Um, I think it focuses on the multiple ways that an individual can experience discrimination. I think that I'm not a fan of it because it focuses on the negative, and whatever you focus on, you get more of. And so I can focus on the fact that I'm old and then allow that to paint my interaction with everyone. I can focus on the fact that I'm a woman and allow that to taint my interactions with everyone. So I don't like to focus on our differences. I like to look at, where is it that we meet and come together that we can build a better world instead of focusing on our negative or our differences or the characteristics that create our tensions. I mean, I worked for many years and people would come to me because they were in the middle of a dispute or they were having difficulties. And my major role was always to try to mediate that and help them resolve their differences rather than look and perpetuate what was creating that tension between them.
Yeah, I see. Joe, I know that a lot of your work focuses on intersectionality, so I'm wondering what your thoughts are in relation to what May was just sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. I do differ a little bit from what Maeve was sharing as far as the usefulness of the term intersectionality. Um, I think that for us to describe the different dynamics between oppression based on identity, I think it's important for us to recognize that where we hold one identity, um, we don't experience just oppression. Like we can experience just oppression. Like for example, for me being Black, I can also experience oppression for me being gay. But then there is a particular dynamic when we talk about being a Black gay person. So this term was actually coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a huge scholar in race, to describe the oppression experienced by Black women in the workplace. That in the past, when women had to or would submit these grievances, they would have to submit two grievances, one for being Black and the other one for being a woman. So this allowed for that conversation to happen, and being intentional that it's not just about one identity or the other. Um, and I totally understand where Maeve is coming from. You know, focusing on the negative brings more negative. But I think it's also important for us to experience that oppression to be able to have the tools to communicate that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Alyssa, I know you also must be doing work with intersectionality just based on your resume and a lot of the active intersectionality you brought to some of the projects you've worked on. Do you have any thoughts along these lines?
Yeah, and I'm very happy that Joe brought up Kimberly Crenshaw because I wrote down her definition. She's like one of my favorite, Black thought. Like she should be classified as a philosopher along with James Baldwin and all other sorts of people. But her definition was, looking at race, gender, class, and other individual characteristics and how they intersect. So I encourage everybody who is listening to go look up Kimberly Crenshaw and learn yourselves. She's amazing. Anyways, I hear where both of you were coming from. And I think that intersectionality, as well as any of these different characteristics are so important. We give these things names in order to have the language to describe what we're experiencing, both positive and negative. And so, while, women, Black people, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, experience oppression, we also experience a lot of beauty within those things. And being able to talk about the intersex of being, a Caribbean woman myself, being seen as Black and African American in American culture and not the same way in Caribbean culture, there's beauty in that. I can talk about the story of skin and, the three families that, a story that's told throughout the West Indies that no other Black person, typically Black American would know that. And that is because we're looking at it through an intersectional lens. We can talk about, all the different, you know, we could talk about slang and we can talk about trends and we can talk about, even just, ballroom within the LGBTQ community, which me as a straight person, I don't know anything, much about that, but just seeing it from an outside perspective, I can see the beauty in that. And though oppression really just strip us from everything, financially and emotionally, it propels us into a place of creation and beauty because we have nothing else. And that is how we tell our story. And we can only tell that story through an intersectional lens. And so for anybody to understand what it is to be, a Black woman, to be, a trans person with disabilities, to be anything in this world, we have to understand what that means in both terms of oppression and privilege. And that's where intersectionality comes from, to allow that conversation to happen. For example, I think a really good example of this is we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, and we see a lot of Black men who unfortunately has been stolen from us. We know their names, we know their stories, we know what happens. But how many people in the same conversation can talk about the Black women who have been shot and killed by police officers? We don't really know. There's not really, yes, we have Say Her Name, but we don't really know. We think, we obviously think of Breonna Taylor, but there's 12 other women that were taken from us last year. And did we see their names in the headlines? Did we see any of their faces on murals? Were there any conversations about particular laws and policies, highlighting their stories? Not really. So that's where intersectionality comes into play. And that's life-saving for many different communities, because it, again, lays a foundation for the policies that are going to protect and elevate and center our voices within these discussions. So, it's a both blessing and a curse, honestly. But I think it's really, really important to be able to navigate that in both respects, because it gives us the language to actually have that conversation. Whereas if we didn't, we'd kind of be stuck. That's not good. So I guess in a long frame, I'm agreeing with both of you in that respect.
Thanks. Yeah, so it sounds like um, having that intersectionality gives a way to name some things, but one thing that it sounds like, May, you're really like you've got a lot of preparedness to take the next steps of action, and I'm really excited to talk to you about that. Not in the next section, but in a little bit, because I think those steps of action are going to be really important. Did anybody else, because this was kind of an interesting topic between everybody, did anybody else want to kind of put a button on that or add anything else about intersectionality?
We can put it on the fish rack for later.
I love that. That sounds good. I did have one, we're going to do one quick other definition, which is by POC or BIPOC. Joe, do you want to take the definition of that real quick, and then we can go to the next section?
Sure. So when we talk about BIPOC, it's a term that's relatively new. So it stands for, it's an acronym. It stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So obviously, people of color includes Black and Indigenous people, but the reason we say BIPOC is to recognize the particular history of violence against Black and Indigenous people in specifically here in the United States. And it's a term that's being adopted. It's a way to acknowledge the continued fight for rights and to really center the discussion around the oppression that we see today.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Alyssa or May, is there anything else you wanted to add to that definition? Thank you. Well, so we have some terms now, and so that gives us a little bit of context. So we also need to know how to like recognize this in our daily lives. So one thing I wanted to talk about is microaggressions. And I think a lot of people have experienced microaggressions, but some people might not know what that is. So I'm wondering if there might be some examples of microaggressions that you may have seen or heard about or even experienced, specifically here in Fairbanks. It'd be interesting to hear about. Alyssa, do you mind to start us off with that one?
Yep. I experience them every day. Every day. My whole life is a microaggression, honestly. Microaggressions, are really subtle forms of covert racism. And what I mean by covert is it's not necessarily apparent, it's not necessarily physical, but it does make an impact. And microaggressions can be anything of, you see my hair, it's like, oh my God, Alyssa, your hair is so cool. Where did you buy it? And I'm like, girl, it's attached to my head. It's mine, from everything. I think one that really just still sticks with me and really hurts. And of course, my dog is over there coughing her throat out again. Go drink water and stop bothering. Go that way. um, one that really sticks with me is, I don't know if you can hear her. Hopefully you can. Is I have been on a working group with the NAACP, and we have been working with the city council about police brutality, wanting to work deeper with the mayor and with the acting chief. And these have been really long-standing conversations, even before the march. Good Lord, woman! Before the march last year, I think it was March. Actually, no, May. It was in May, in response to George Floyd's death. And when the News Miner came out with that opinion piece about how intersectionality is automatically political and how the mayor needs to look out for that, it was just a slap in the face, because here are community members that are really concerned and willing to make their communities better, and to be told that just wanting to be a part of the conversation, that my experience as a Black woman in Fairbanks, that has been followed by troopers and police officers in stores in my own neighborhood, that my existence in this place is automatically political, and that I don't have a right to ask the mayor for simple inclusion in those decisions of deciding who our next chief, which is going to set the tone for how our police interact with not just communities of color, but everybody in general, was just like, it's like, kind of like, how dare you? Like, you could be using your platform, your privilege, to be expanding this conversation around how we as communities of color, how marginalized communities, how Fairbanksans in general can really talk about this and what is needed. Because regardless if you've ever had a bad experience with law enforcement, I think we can all attest that we want law enforcement to do and be better. We want to have better relationships. And how do we do that? And to be told that they need to watch out for us and asking to be included, which is like a really very public microaggression, specifically for me. And I think to the rest of the working group and several other people, it's just very disheartening to know that wanting to elevate this type of conversation was not welcome, when simultaneously people are asking us, well, how does it feel to be, a Black woman? How does it feel to be, people of color, or, people from communities marginalized, when then our existence becomes political? So,
Uh,
huge
yeah,
Achilles.
yeah. That I'm so sorry that happened, and it sounds like it's like there's a always like this qualification or hurdle that you have to go over to get to just sort of base level what um, what would be afforded to anybody else to be looked at. Um, May, do you have any kind of thoughts on like microaggressions and how, if you've seen them or experienced them, especially here in Fairbanks?
Well, I want to start by saying that my understanding is that the issue of being involved in selection of the new chief of police has been resolved, and that there is participation on behalf of the NAACP. So, I know that you have to speak up, and sometimes you have to put your foot in the door to get there. But I'm glad. Uh, I'm glad that has become part of the process. As far as microaggressions go, I'm probably more of an advocate of developing a thick skin. And maybe that comes from my background, because without having a thick skin, you're not going to be able to create this social change that you want. Working in the field of equal employment opportunity, you are the odd man out, and you have to just take a stance. And that doesn't mean to take it in an aggressive way, but it's like you become the conscience of an organization. In order to be able to do that, you have to have a thick skin. You have to have tolerance with people as they work through this and you come together. So rather than, once again, rather than look at the negative and and labeling somebody as addressing me with microaggressions, it's about having patience and kindness. And if you are going to do this work, if you don't put on a coat and a mantle of love before you go into it, you are going to end up operating in a destructive manner. And you're not going to ultimately be successful. And so as far as microaggressions go, yeah, they exist, but don't give them too much weight.
Just kind of pinging off of that, do you, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later, but in some ways that sounds like that makes the responsibility of like making those steps towards change or something kind of go on to the person who is, experiencing the oppression. So I'm kind of curious what you think about that, especially with sort of like that idea of the balance that you had brought up initially.
So from what I'm hearing is you think that I'm saying that the burden should be on the person that is hearing it.
I think that from my perspective, it sounds like it might end up being that way. I'm just particularly with the idea of sort of putting on a thick skin, as that sounds like an action that one has to do, themselves. So I'm just curious about where you feel that balance is. I wouldn't think that the other person would then have to, make a change if the receiver is putting on a thick skin.
Well, putting on a thick skin is not necessarily taken on the criticism or the comment of the other person. It's saying, I am enough. I am okay. Regardless of what how you approach me, I'm not going to waver. I stand for justice and it's like that mother look. It's like, when you're a mother, you say, no, we're not going to do this. And that's it. That's, no matter what the child is doing, they're throwing a fit or whatever. And so, no, it's not about putting the burden back on the person that's hearing it, but I can't change another person. I can only change the reaction. My power lies in with how I react to that person, not with trying to change that other person.
So it sounds like there's like a really deep centeredness in knowing who you are, which is,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
that's really powerful. And it sounds like again you're very like forward looking at the next actions. But I do want to
Well,
come back to. Oh, go ahead.
if you're not forward looking, then you're going to get stuck. And there's a lot of mud and mire and muck that you can get stuck in. And it's never been my choice to remain in that. It's always been, look at Martin Luther King. What he did that was so excellent is he held up the vision for us to see. He said, here's where we're going. Here's what that looks like. And he held up that vision. And so, that's what you have to do if you're going to create the social justice that we're talking about.
Yeah, that I can hear that. Just to bring it back to the one question though, I did want to see, Joe, what you thought, or if you had any reflections based on what Alyssa and May shared.
Yeah, absolutely. I can really see where Alyssa and May are coming from. I think that when May mentions that there needs to be like a really strong sense of self, especially when it comes to confronting microaggressions and whether they're blatant or blatant, I think that's accurate. I definitely think that we just need to be careful because there again, I want to reference back to the intersectional. We don't really know what a person's background is, like what their story is. If we tell somebody that that in order to thrive, you need to like develop this like a really strong sense of self, but like we don't understand like what other nuances that are in play, then it may become complicated. I mean, it may not necessarily be the most constructive. I definitely think that May is right. Like, to do this work, you got to have a tough skin. You know that people are not always going to be happy. However, it is not only people who are doing social justice that are experiencing microaggressions. It's people who are every day, for any sort of part of their identity, that have to like constantly face this. And not everybody has that mental fortitude or the privilege to, you know, study up and really explore their identity. Maybe it's an issue of safety. Maybe it's an issue of resources. Maybe it's an issue of you know, priorities in the sense of surviving. It's not always easy. And it's also important for us to recognize the impacts of microaggressions. Somebody who is constantly experiencing microaggression, whether no matter how strong this person may self-identify as, it's like that droplet of water that is hitting at that stone. Eventually, it's going to break it. I think it's important for us to acknowledge not just like how we are playing into the system, but like how can when we change the system so that people who are coming behind us have the ability to succeed and thrive and not have to go through like what we're going through.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put that, Joe. And I think you had brought up in one of our previous questions just the idea of gaslighting. It sounds in some ways that May, you remind me of like you're ready for battle. You're going to go out there, and there's a lot of action that you have been doing and that you are very familiar with doing. And I think that there is a common thread these days of maybe taking a step to look and acknowledge. And it reminds me a lot of just the idea of just of hearing all of the realities that are kind of occurring. And I think, you know, being in that place and being able to go forward as well, going back to going forward, which May, I can really hear that you're ready to move forward and do those next actions. Um,
Let me just let me pause for a minute and just say I'm not a warrior. I'm
okay,
not going into battle
sure.
because I don't believe that the path to peace and to unity
Hmm.
is through fighting.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
think that path is through collaboration.
Hmm.
And so, sometimes I have to act with grace. I know people are, issuing, if you want to call it microaggressions, but you have to give them that benefit of doubt. That's where grace comes in. And a lot of this has to do with personal growth. It's impossible to do this work unless you've done your own personal growth work, or you're going to end up angry and frustrated and bitter. And in order not to go there, okay, maybe thick skin is not the right word, but it's about knowing who you are. It's about having I don't even know how to describe it. It's you're unfaltering. You're not going to move.
You've got your
So
feet
no, I'm
planted.
not a
Hmm.
warrior. I'm not a warrior at all because I don't think that that's going to get us where we want to go.
Hmm. Um, yeah, and it sounds in a way that that is also sort of again coming back to like, you know, putting that that coat on that is in a way kind of like a way to uh, cope or be able to deal with some of the larger systemic issues and just the interpersonal things. Um, I am wondering about if, Joe or Alyssa, do either of you have anything else you'd like to follow up with on this?
Sure, I can add my perspective here. I think it's a really interesting conversation when we're talking about fortitude, because in my perspective, microaggressions directly lead to policy and directly leads to violence. And so when we are not naming these things, we allow for harmful policies, we allow for violence to happen to marginalized communities. And so again, we have to be really careful about that language and also understand that, we are in this work because, of oppression and because of systematic violence. Um, Nobody should have to be putting on a coat of armor to go to work. No one should have to put on a coat of armor to go grocery shopping. Nobody should have to put on a coat of armor to go to the pharmacy and pick up their medication. But here, because of the systematic violence that we are experiencing as marginalized people, we don't have a choice but to. And that can directly result in our lowering of well-being. That's not our decision. It's not our choice. It's if we have to live in a world where we can be fired from our jobs randomly because, the person does not like who signed the lease, they don't agree that you should exist in this world, that's not necessarily something that I can control. That's not necessarily something that I can prepare for. I mean, you kind of have to, but when it happens, it happens. You can't prepare for when your apartment gets vandalized and you go to the officers and they're like, well, we don't help your kind. You can't prepare, when you are in a new job and they have a policy saying that you can't wear braids. So I definitely hear you in that. Yes, in this work, you have to know yourself. And the thing is that for me, I know exactly who I am. And ever since I knew exactly who I was, I have had to fight against teachers, doctors, elected leaders, pretty much everything, not just personal, but we have to acknowledge the power dynamic that we are placed in regardless of our characteristics and our identities and where we come from. That a lot of times, yeah, someone can say something really stupid to me and I can look at them and be like, exit left. That's all great and fine. But that has a lasting impact, especially if I have to deal with that every single day. And yes, I'm a community organizer and yes, I know what that comes with, but that doesn't mean that I'm not seeing a counselor for it. This is incredibly hard work and it does not need to be that. So we need to have these conversations and we need to name these for exactly what it is, because there is no reason why I should have to deal with, or anybody should deal with, microaggressions, because we know that microaggressions come from a lack of understanding and it comes from a lack of fear, of who I am and what that means. And in order for us to get to that place of, of fortitude, in order to get to that place of unity and understanding, we have to address the real acts of violence first. And violence isn't just physical, I have bruises or I end up dead. Violence is, emotional, financial, spiritual violence that, marginalized people are experiencing, not just because of other people's choices or words or perspectives, but what those perspectives leads to in terms of policies and in terms of access. And those are things that we cannot prepare for, that we cannot, combat without other people understanding what that translates into and helping us to dismantle that. So in a way, it's not really my responsibility to have thick skin. It's y'all's responsibility to understand the impact of your words and choosing them correctly and making sure that you're honoring me and everyone else around you in the ways that you should. Because I can come to you as a person who honors you and wants to move forward, but if you don't see me as an equal person, then that's never going to happen, no matter how hard I try. And that was the first lesson I learned as an organizer. Let me give you an example. All the things that I do, and I bring people to Juna the first time talking to a legislator, and we have a senator that's calling me a slave in a constituent meeting. There's nothing I can do about that in that situation. That's not my responsibility to say, sir, does it look like we are in 1347? No, we are in 2020. You might want to recorrect what you just said. That's not my responsibility. That's his responsibility to be like, oh, wait, I should not say that. So we really need to be aware of the power dynamics and be working to dismantling that, while actively working with our own communities and our own spaces of how we have those conversations with grace and fortitude, because both of them are important.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think that um, I'm going to go back to. I mean, this does kind of tie into one of the questions we wanted to ask. your example, especially Alyssa, about privileged folks like knowingly or unknowingly upholding the systems, particularly like systemic racism and oppression. Um, I mean, yeah, like I hope that person who said that like has some sort of awareness of the I don't know, but like, what are other ways that privileged folks do uphold the system? In all of the different ways, as we had talked about, the different ways that you can be oppressed or the different ways that you can be privileged. How does that interact with our society and kind of keep oppression where it is? Um, Alyssa, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I think, unintentional, I think where it starts is intentional and unintentional biases. And when we don't check them, when we don't name them, when we don't take responsibility for them. And like everybody has, said, privilege, you have to take a little bit to recognize that you have privilege. Even though I'm a woman of color, I still have privilege of mobility. I have privilege of partnership and adoption and what happens to my body after I die. I have all of these different things. But if I am not constantly checking that, I'm going to miss a lot of ways in which, our government mandates and allocates those different decisions and resources. And I think the biggest way that people with privilege, which is all of us, um, unintentionally and intentionally uphold those is by defaming or belittling or dismissing the experiences and the real time relays of oppression from the voices of people marginalized. When we do not listen to these communities, when we're saying, yes, you know, um, all these different, marriage equality is great, right? But that's not the end. That's not the end all, right? There's still issues in terms of adoption. There's still issues in terms of funeral services. There's still issues in terms of marriage benefits and life insurance. And, even something as simple as having to pay to get your name changed and what that means legally, especially when you're trying to adopt children and get a house together. And, when you pass and what that means of who gets control of your body and your assets. And you can't possibly know any of those things if you're not listening to LGBTQ people, if you're not listening to those people who have those experiences, because then you don't know. You don't know the gaps of the system. You don't know the gaps in your own experience that you could just be missing because your day to day to day, you don't have to deal with those questions until you got to deal with those questions. So I think that's really the first place where we start to, uphold it is by not listening. Like Maya Angelou said, if you don't know everything, but once you know better, then you start to do better. So I guess in a solution to that, really start listening. Like when you hear these different incidents and experiences, you shouldn't be questioning them, you should be listening to understand them, because then you can understand your own experience through these systems a lot better. And then a lot of things start to connect. And it just opens the door for your own self research and self reflection, and maybe where your internal biases are, because we all have them. And that's okay, because we have all grown up in a white supremacist, heteronormative, cisnormative, patriarchal society. We're all going to hold on to things, and it's okay to admit that. And then it's okay to reflect that and unlearn that and learn what it really is to be in community with each other. So, and only to do that, you got to listen.
Yeah, that makes total sense. We had a question from one of the viewers here that kind of goes with that a little bit, but also goes back to the idea of like microaggressions or instances where we might be kind of upholding or utilizing our privilege in a way that we may not know. Kind of go back to the unintentional thing. Um, this question is, some microaggressions are intentional, some might be born of ignorance and unintentional. How can we signal that we are receptive to being corrected or called out on committing a microaggression? Joe, do you have any thoughts for that?
Sorry, I was muted. No, absolutely, and thank you for that question. I think that's a very interesting, I guess, like perspective, in that being open to being called out. How do I communicate that I'm open to being corrected? I think it's not always as easy as like signaling a flag that says, "Hey, I'm trying to be self-aware. Please correct me when I'm wrong." But I definitely see how it would be incredible if we could do that. I think that one way that I have been open to people correcting, and I try to like do that, is when I catch myself correcting myself, acknowledging that mistake and moving on, but making sure that if I, for example, if I am talking to one of my gender nonconforming friends or colleagues, and I accidentally misgender them, I immediately correct myself and I move on. It's not about me, it's about the impact that I'm carrying, and how do I correct that. So as far as like signaling is, I think of this as how do I signal that I'm an ally to these people. And Alyssa was really incredible in explaining this, that we need to listen, not to respond, but we need to listen to understand. And that's even more important for allies, because simply becoming allies and self-identifying as allies is not enough. Us like really being allies is a continuous work of self-reflection, of seeing what are my blind spots and like how can I improve upon them. And I think that's going to be reflected in your everyday actions. When you see that you're having a meeting, but there are other perspectives that are not in the table to make those decisions. How do you make that space? How do you use your privilege to then uplift and highlight people who are experiencing oppression? So yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you. Did either of May or Alyssa, did either of you have any thoughts on that front? Alyssa?
Yeah, I would say, what Joe said. And I think, probably that person that asked that question is like, okay, but how? And, I would say, in my experience in research, that really just comes from immersing yourself in whatever community, Lord, community. You can tell what I do for a living. A community that you are making that commitment to. I would never have known anything about LGBTQ people unless I started, doing things with LGBTQ people. That meant going to their events. That meant going to movies and sit-ins and organizational meetings and just being there to listen, because you learn so much, sharing their memes and getting on their tumblers and like getting to know all the slang and whatnot, because there's a lot of slang, trust me. It's like that's how you learn, is when you start participating in the communities that you're making that commitment to. And I would also suggest having a process buddy. I experienced this when I was doing my study abroad and I was relearning my culture, and there were so many things that I didn't know because I was never born on the island. My mom was my process buddy, somebody that I can trust, that I know that I can say something stupid and she knows how to tell me, Alyssa, that was stupid. You want to rethink that? It's like, thank you, mom. We go from there. So I would really suggest getting a process buddy, because the last thing you want to do is tax somebody in that community being responsible for educating you, right? You want somebody that can gently and kindly guide you when you feel a little apprehensive, or you're going to make a mistake, or you're not really sure where to go or how to ask or even who to ask. Having somebody that you can trust and that knows your signals, knows your body language, knows what you're trying to say, to help guide you in the right way in finding that information out and finding what that looks like for you, is something that I've definitely found very, very helpful in new spaces.
I love that. That's a great way to put that. I'm definitely going to use that term. So, and just to kind of clarify a little bit, you had sort of mentioned this, but you had kind of said that it's smart to try to find that process buddy who's not in the community that you're learning about, so that you're not putting that labor onto them. I think that's really a great way to look at that. Um, okay, so I'm just looking through a couple questions here. Um, And then, okay, super. Well, we had been talking about the way that like privileges or like privileged folks uphold these various forms of oppression in society. And I wondered, Joe, if you had anything else you wanted to add about that to what Alyssa had been saying.
Yeah. I know earlier you got a question of somebody asking about gaslighting and what that meant. And Alyssa explained this without calling it gaslighting, but it's when we downplay or ignore or disregard or, make somebody feel like their experience is not reality, and the impacts that has, that people will feel like they are actually potentially losing their mind. It's like, oh, maybe I'm overthinking things. Maybe I am overreacting or oversensitive, when in reality it's gaslighting in play. So that's kind of like how that would play out. And then at the beginning of the workshop, and when May was describing Lady Liberty with the blindfold, and that explicitly did not mean color blindness, I really resonated with that, because it's completely true. Color blindness might seem like it's something that might be for for equality and equity, but in reality, when we are colorblind, we are disregarding history. We're disregarding trauma that has gone through generations, through centuries. For us to truly be allies, and for us to truly be anti-racist, we need to acknowledge that, yes, we want to be better, but we cannot ignore the past. We need to learn from the past, and we need to also recognize the impacts that it's currently having today.
Absolutely. Yeah, May, did you have any thoughts about that, about how our various systems and the folks that we had mentioned about the different levels of privilege tend to uphold the oppression and racism in our society?
Well, I mean, we've 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 gone down several different trails, and I don't know that I've kept up with every trail that we have been down, which is where we get into trouble when we're trying to do this work. And that we have to take an issue and look at it and explore it and make sure everyone at the table is understanding it. It's there's a lot of let me just call it old knowledge. The Covey said you have to listen to understand. You have to, so that's not a new concept. It's something that has been with us for a long time that is now being reinforced, and I think is very, very important. So, you're asking me now if I'm understanding right, if we get off of that track and onto a different one, you're asking me, how does this play out? What are examples? Am I correct with that?
Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
okay. So here's what I would say. I worked for the federal government for 27 years. The last 14 of that was processing complaints of discrimination. So, if you want examples, I can come up with examples. A lot of times, and you're not going to like when I say this, but this is what I'm going to say, is that, our laws are in place so that we can ensure equality. And if you go back to those laws, and if you encounter something like Alyssa did, where somebody's using that inappropriate language or racist language, there are processes in place to take care of that. I am sure that a legislator cannot just get away with making such blatant, disrespectful comments. But, I worked in the employment realm. And so if someone believed that they were being discriminated against, they had the right to file a complaint. And I was there to ensure that there was a due process. And so that comes back to that balance, that there has to be somebody there that's not colorblind. It's not about being colorblind, it's about being impartial. Go back to what I was talking about at the beginning of this with that statue of justice, that the person, the statue has a blinder on, so they're impartial. So I had to ensure that there was due process in that system. And so there's several different theories in the law to address discrimination. So the first one is disparate treatment, and that means that I'm being treated differently as an individual. And so what what I used to counsel people is, look at what's going on in your situation. And if you can say, if not for the fact that I'm a woman, this would not have happened to me. So if not for my protected category, if not for my race, I would have gotten that training. If not for my disability, I would have gotten that promotion. So, that's to address the individual discrimination that's going on in our society. If you want to address the systemic things, that's called disparate impact. And that is when a policy or a practice on its face looks like it's fair, but it's not. It has a disparate impact to it. And that's usually when you end up with class action suits. Then you have the theory of equal pay. You have which is pretty obvious. You have a theory of accommodation, and that's where you're leveling the playing field for someone with a disability. And you also provide accommodations for religion. You've got the theory of harassment, and that's those little, what you call them microaggressions. That's when those microaggressions pile up and they have an impact, and that falls under that theory. And then you have the theory of retaliation, that when you exercise your rights, you're retaliated against. So there are measures, there are things in place that can take care of this. And I don't know that everyone understands what their rights are. They have a right to file a complaint if they believe that they have been discriminated against, and they have a right to due process in adjudicating that complaint.
Yeah, and that is, so it sounds like, and you were one of the facilitators to help look through that and to help uphold that. So in a way, you were one of the folks who was helping to hopefully promote, as you said, some equality. On a personal level, I'm wondering about how we can facilitate this on a day-to-day way, because I think that outside of the sort of the scope of the government, it sounds like there are a lot of instances of potential microaggressions or privilege where you may not understand a different group's perspective or their experience. Um, and so going back to our definitions and the idea of what is anti-racism and what is racial justice, I'd like to bring it back to Alyssa, if I can, about what are some of the first steps to practicing anti-racism for ourselves and in our own lives on a broader sense. What can we do to start working on this?
Yep, apologies. She is being so naughty right now. She's trying to get it in
Oh,
the trash. I'm like, girl, not right now. You are gonna sit here and you are not going to irritate me right now.
she wants to get in the limelight.
Lord, this dog sometimes. I love you, but sometimes. You need to be anti-racist right now. I think how we do that in our personal lives is, you know, understanding the systems that we live and understanding the peoples that we're interacting with. And what I mean by that is, quite frankly, there are a lot of policies and a lot of procedures that when discrimination happens, when microaggressions happen, that we can report them. And I think it's really important to remember that those things aren't always adequate. We can only report them if, we have access to those places, and most of the time we don't. We can only if the people in charge or in power actually believe that it's happening, um, especially within the workplace. If there's retaliation that comes along with that, if you do see something or you do experience something, especially in this state where it's right to work, we get fired for that. And so a lot of people aren't actually empowered to report. They aren't actually empowered to seek help, because then we lose our jobs, we lose our homes, we lose our livelihoods. And recognizing that as the reality, is really, really important, when thinking about anti-racism and what we need to be doing and what we need to be dismantling together. Um, I think that, it's all interconnected, that there's really not a difference between what we're doing in the workplace, what we're doing in communities, and what we're doing with ourselves, because we're asking the same questions, we're having the same dialogues, and we are advocating for the same things. And that is, equity, that is justice, that's reparations, that's land back, all these different things, um, that we need to be having personal dialogue with. But we can't necessarily do that if we don't really, if we're not aware, or if we're not, I don't know another word, but if we're not actively living those realities, you know what I mean? um and like I said before, the only way that if you don't experience that, if you can't experience that, then the only way to understand that is by listening to those who are actively experiencing it. um because you can't have the goal of dismantling oppression if you aren't listening to the oppressed, or if you don't understand the oppressed and what those realities are, and how difficult it is to really navigate, spaces within our own governance and spaces in our own communities. um, and what I do personally, in this, because just because I'm a woman of color does not mean that I do not hold racist values or racist views. And it is just as much my responsibility to voice my truth as it is to elevate others and understand others' truth. And that is having real dialogue with people. That is being strong in a way, but really just courageous, and facilitating brave spaces and not just safe spaces for people to have that dialogue, to me. Not necessarily in just, yes, I'm a safe person to come to, but how am I actively showing people that I'm a safe person to come to? That even if I don't understand fully or all of it, that I am making the commitment. How do I take that responsibility to show the other person that I am their, not just their ally, but their advocate, and that I'm making a commitment to making this community better, that I'm a person that they can call at 3 o'clock in the morning, or they can call when they've never testified before. And so for me, and it's going to look different for especially everybody who's listening, it's a commitment to be making to your community and to your close ones around you, because there's many ways to participate in the movement, and you just have to figure out what you want that part to be. It's not always fighting and getting in people's face and yelling at electeds. Sometimes it's just being like the cool auntie that people can come over and eat food and just decompress. Sometimes it is a teacher that's taking a stand to really be teaching our full truths to our young ones and our little ones and our not so little ones, and having and showing us how to have not just those debates, but those dialogues, and learning how to have that in a civil space. It's for our advocates in the workspace that are really understanding those gaps and working to fill them, and make sure that the people who are making decisions are going to have not just the best intentions, but the best impacts for the people that they are directly responsible for and to. So for, I guess, long story short, for me, in a personal setting, it's a commitment. And we need to make that commitment not only to ourselves to unlearn and relearn, it's a commitment to show other people that we really not just have their best interests, but we really do have their best futures in mind, and that we are going to hold space for them to be their full selves, even when we don't understand, don't agree, or don't know.
Thank you. I think that also kind of goes back to that question about signaling. You know, it sounds like a big thing that everybody is saying over and over is listen, listen, listen. So thank you for sharing all of that. May, what are your thoughts on how we move forward with anti-racism?
Oh, I think the first thing that I want to say is that I feel like I wasn't clear, that the rights and privileges that I talked about are not just for the government, they're also for the private sector. And even if you don't have somebody within your organization that you can go to if you feel that you are being discriminated against, you have the Alaska Commission for Human Rights. So, there are avenues to address these things. And yeah, I agree that you do need somebody that can help you emotionally through these things. I'm not saying that it's easy. It's not an easy thing to do, to oppose discrimination. But unless we take those steps, we're not going to undo a lot of the stuff that happens. So how do we move forward? Well, I don't know what every soul needs. I know what my own soul needs. And so I'll talk from my personal perspective. And I think listening is key. It is absolutely essential. I think education is key. I think that we have to educate ourselves, not just from one point of view, but from multiple points of view. So, you have to read books, from all different perspectives, and in order to be able to get into that balanced place where you can address things. I think it's important that you reach out, that you start crossing those color lines or those other uh, invisible lines, that you start building connections and bonds, and that most of all, most important, is that you do that with grace and with love. If I am attacking someone, then their defense mechanism is coming up, and I'll get no further than that. Where if I meet them where they are and I can collaborate with them, then I have an opportunity for growth and for moving our society forward.
I love that idea of approaching all of these things with love. I think that's so important. Joe, what are your thoughts about how we move forward with anti-racism in society and personally?
I am muted again. I don't want to sound like I'm repeating what everybody else is saying, but I think that I'm just gonna add. I think this process of really practicing anti-racism takes humility. It takes self-reflection. It's not something that one day you can just flip a switch and I'm no longer racist, or I'm no longer holding racist ideas. It's something that's going to take work, and it's going to take work for the rest of your life. We can't undo 500 years of a system built on white supremacy and oppression to be flipped on or flipped off overnight. So I think one of the first steps that we can take is self-reflection, and then educating yourself. We live in a time where we have access to a myriad of information in the palm of our hands, and I guess I want to really reiterate that we do have access to this information, and bring back a point that Alyssa mentioned earlier, about who it is that we are putting the burden of education on. There are some Black, Indigenous, or people or persons of color that may be willing to help us through this journey, but no one is entitled to those stories or to their help or to our help. And the reason that I say that is because sometimes talking about our own experiences with racism or with oppression is reliving trauma. And we just need to be conscious that what we're asking people of color to do, when we are asking them to share their stories. And again, some may be willing to. I know that I've had multiple conversations with my white friends and family members about like my own personal experience. However, sometimes I recognize that I need to take a step back and realize, okay, this is emotionally draining for me. I need to take care of myself. However, there are other ways. Like my stories, sharing my stories or my experiences is not the only way that my friends and family can explore what it means to be anti-racist. So yeah, I think self-reflection and educating yourself as much as possible. And yeah, there are resources out there. There are different organizations you can join that can help you along your journey.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. And we're going to share some of those resources, I believe, at the end here. We are almost to our 90-minute time. I feel like we could probably keep talking for quite a while. But if folks want to stick around, we do have some questions that came up. And if the panelists are willing to chat with us just a little bit longer with some of these Q&As, does that sound all right with you folks? Is that good? Okay, wonderful.
Yep.
So while I'm getting my questions in a queue here, I just have one other last little thing to ask all of you, and that is kind of like, how do we, and this does kind of dovetail with what Joe was saying, how do we stay physically and mentally and emotionally safe while you're practicing anti-racism? And why is, and I think Joe kind of spoke to this a little bit, but why is doing that kind of self-care and protecting the space of activists important? If Alyssa, do you have any thoughts about, or what do you do to kind of keep yourself healthy and whole and mentally safe while you're practicing anti-racism and all of the other ways that intersect with that?
Yeah, I would say for me, a big part of it is community care. You know, the notion that you do this by yourself and you suffer alone is BS and is meant to drain you. It doesn't work. Um, so, you know, surrounding yourself with close ones that you really trust, that you can process with, that you could do fun things with, um, doing this work and during this movement and revolution with people that you trust and people that are close to you are extremely important. And that is really hard in a society where, you know, individualism and pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and, you know, got to get on the grind is, you know, sort of the norm. You know, there's nothing that we do in this world alone. So we all need to do better at reaching out to the people that we trust and the people that we consider our close ones to really confide and be with each other. So that's really the first thing is communal care. The second for me is really being honest about where you're at. You know, I mentioned that, you know, I was going to counseling and that's because, you know, being a woman of color is hard in this country and not through devices of my own. And, you know, it took a really long time for me to sort of recognize that the pain and the grief and the like the distress and the constant distress that I was feeling was not from things that I was doing, it was things that I was experiencing. And I had to learn that difference and find ways to cope because I can't really explain to anybody how it feels to advocate for your own basic rights. Like, you know, I can never explain to you how it feels to have to advocate for your rights going into the Supreme Court. You know, that your ability to live in this world, your ability to function and interact in this world is dependent on Supreme Court justices and not just because you exist. Like, that's not something I can explain. That is only something to be felt. And it is important to be cognizant of that with yourself and recognize what you need, which is a journey. And the answer changes from time to time or situation to situation. And so my way of dealing with that was, you know, counseling and recognizing that I had the privilege of that I have enough money and that I have a job that has health insurance and can cover, you know, at least some of that. And that is a privilege that not a lot of people have. So I'm really grateful. And the whole point of me having that privilege is to find ways to give that privilege to others who don't. And I can only do that if I'm healthy. So I took that stuff to make sure that I'm healthy so I can continue to pour into others' cups and not empty my own. So that's what I would say. You know, mental health is just as important as physical health. Your brain is part of your body. I don't understand why we have this stigma. Well, I do understand why we have this stigma, but it's stupid. You know what I'm saying? Like, take care of your body, hydrate, wash your hands, be in contact with your community and your family, whoever that is to you. And no movement is complete without art and music. So delve into the things that bring you joy, because that's what's going to heal you and that's what's going to propel you even when you're actively having to fight for your rights and, you know, being that person on the front lines, which ain't easy. So make sure you're healthy before you go on the front lines.
Awesome. Yeah. Yes, I love that. Um, May, what do you advise for you know, that those kind of taking care of yourself when you're doing this work?
Um, I've always been blessed with having good coworkers in this, and I agree that you need to have someone you can talk to and process with to keep you balanced, to keep you in perspective, so that you're not awfulizing it, you're not thinking you're a victim, that you continue to maintain your personal power. So yeah, that's an important thing when you're doing this kind of work. You know, I don't know what else to say. Everybody has their own process for healing. Some people exercise. Um, some people talk about it. Some people go to counselors, or you know, or so you have to figure out what's best for you, because each individual has different ways of unburdening their hearts and their souls.
Absolutely. Joe, what do you think about that self-care and what works for you, and do you have any advice?
So, and I never, I've been doing this work for about 5 years now. And last summer was one of the times, one of the few times that I felt like I needed to take a step back. Um, I found myself that I was just like ready. I needed to go. I was going, and I'm really taking a break for myself. And not really also realizing how much of an impact it was doing to like my emotional health, to the time that I was spending with my family. Um, so I think that in a moment of high stress, I failed to recognize my own burnout signs. Um, and it is so important to not only recognize what those signs are, but also have mechanisms in place to respond to them. As Alyssa mentioned, if you like art and that's what drives you, you know, make sure that you take a time to do something that fills your cup, you know, that makes you feel happy. As May mentioned, having people to process through things so that you don't go to bed being like, okay, now I have this like huge load in my mind that I cannot process, or I haven't, you know, even talked about or even voiced out that I feel overwhelmed. Um, then it's so important to have those things in place. Um, I also want to preface that this work is emotional labor. It sometimes it's questioning everything we've ever known and unlearning what those things are, unlearning unspoken rules or customs or views that, you know, have been taught to us or passed down from generations to generations, and that can be very emotionally taxing. um, so when you're engaging in this work, it's very important for us to very explicitly be able to mention and say and point to what our resources are in order for us to process and keep ourselves emotionally, mentally safe. Whether that is, as Alyssa mentioned, whether that's counseling, whether it's having a friend to converse and talk through things, whether that is an activity that you do for, you know, to fill your cup, whatever that is. But being able to like know what those are, and recognize when you're feeling like this is like taking away from you. But yeah, it's hard. It's hard work.
Yeah, and all of this is hard work, and I really appreciate all of the time you all have taken. Before we get to our Q&As, and we've got some really cool questions from folks, I did want to let everybody know that a couple things. So we're going to be emailing a form that is a little survey at the end of this, and it's going to everybody who registered, and it is going to it'll give you space to ask other questions if you happen to think of them, or if we don't get to your question. It'll also, I believe, kind of give some room for questions that you might have for panels going forward. And then it will also put you on the list to be able to receive updates in the future when we have our panel coming up. And I'm going to share a slide of the of what the URL to get to that form is. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to pop up a couple questions here. I did want to mention one other thing, and it'll come here with the slides as well, is that if you would like to donate towards our working group as we continue to do more panels, one of the things that's really important to us is that we do pay people for their labor, especially our panelists particularly. And so that is where what we're trying to get that funding for. You can donate to the Fairbanks Venmo. That is at Fairbanks-NAACP. And I think you can write in a memo that it is for the Racism 101 panel. And that will help the chapter direct the funds. And I will have that and also information for where you can send a check up here on a slide. I'm going to get that up, but while I'm doing this, I am going to ask a couple questions to the panelists here. We had a couple questions come up about code switching, and so I wonder if one of you folks might want to define what code switching is so that we can kind of have a basis for that.
Yeah, I can take a turn at that. So code switching, I think about code switching a lot, about like, how do I engage with different groups of people in my life based not just on, whether it's my friends or my family or my coworkers or my students, but also like what other identities play into that. The way that I talk to my fellow Black folks is not the same way that I talk to my coworkers that are white, or it doesn't even, it's not even the same when I talk to coworkers that are white versus coworkers that are Black. I feel like there are ways that we, whether it's conscious or unconscious, change the way that we communicate in order for us to feel like we have that sense of belonging. I personally use code switch a lot. I feel like as people of color, we kind of have to become masters of code switching. For example, and I'm going to share one of my personal experiences. English is not my first language. It's Spanish. I'm originally from Borican, or also known as Puerto Rico. So when I came to mainland US, I had a pretty heavy accent. And I feel like whenever I was speaking, even in English with like fellow Puerto Ricans, I was always like being able to just not even worry about it. But then when I went to school and everything like that, I not that there was anything that was like very overtly telling me, oh, you need to assimilate. I did feel the pressure that in order to be taken seriously, I need to make sure that I come across as neutral as possible. So I felt the pressure to like get rid of my accent. Not something that I'm proud of now. It was something that I felt like I was proud of then, because I was like, oh, wow, I sound really, not Puerto Rican. And that was something that in my mind was like, okay, successful. And it's taking a lot of reflection and acceptance that, oh my God, I just played into this. I just played into what I now say that I don't do. So just because like there's people working on anti-racism or people who do this racial justice or social justice work, that does not mean that we don't play into these systems. But yeah, code switching is both something that at times is inevitable, and at times it's a means of survival. It's a means of defense. It's a means of making sure that we blend into the background just enough so that we can stay safe and that we can provide for our families and have a livelihood. So yeah, it's both a tool and a curse.
Yeah, absolutely. May or Alyssa, do you have kind of, Joe, you really answered the question with the definition there too, with some of your experience, so thank you. May or Alyssa, have either of you experienced code switching or have any, one of the questions was, how often do you find yourself code switching? Does that resonate with either of you? Alyssa, do you have any thoughts of that with code switching?
Yes, I do that every day. All the time, every time. And just like, Joe said, it's a means of survival, because, they're really languages. You know, AVA is a language, patois is a language. And we use that to interact and connect with people. And in a country and a system that does not value that, that criminalizes that, that kills that, it's a means of survival. And I have to do that with pretty much everybody in my life. It's like, especially at home, my family is Caribbean. We come from Barbados, and our entire language in Barbados is specifically code switching, because when Britain colonized, they're like, all this speak you doing? Yeah, you're done with that. and I wish my mom was here, because she could speak to that of, going to school and being like, yes, yes, madam, no, madam, this, that, the third. And then she get home and we talk our regular talk. And I don't really have an accent because, again, I wasn't born in the island, but, I heard it in my house. And so I picked up a little bit of the accent, and all during school, you know, growing up, they would always put me, even though I had really, fine grades from what I would remember, they would always put me in language development courses. And, because they thought I had a speech impediment. And that's specifically because they did not know anything about Caribbean culture or Caribbean languages, or the fact that it's not broken English, that it's an actual language. And that's what I was speaking to them. But I, being a 5-year-old, did not really have the language to tell them, I'm speaking like my granddad, thank you. There's nothing wrong with me. So it's a means for survival, and it's beautiful, and it's not something it's something to honor. And we're made not to honor that because of obvious reasons. But I think my whole life has been resistance of that, and being grateful for that, and saying, no, I know exactly who I am. I know exactly where I come from. I know exactly where my ancestors were born and buried, and I carry that with me. So when I say that I'm Bajan, when I say that I'm West Indian, and when I speak our language, I'm honoring that history, and you as an ignorant person will not take that from me. And people get upset at that, but that's okay. I would like to give people an assignment if I can. I think music is a wonderful way to understand this even further beyond just the things that we're saying. And there's a wonderful song that's called Black Boy Shapeshift, by, I cannot pronounce it because English is confusing for me. Miyamoto, I hope that's what it is. Miyamoto is Black Enough. Their album Burn/Build. It's a Black Boy Shapeshift. And yes, it's explicit, and I'm asking you to listen to it again because you're gonna be like, oh, they said that word. Okay, yeah. There's a reason that they say that word, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when you listen to the end of it. So bear with it. It's important, and I want you to listen to that lesson. You can find it pretty much everywhere on Google, Spotify, whatever. That's my request for you to do some further education and why we have so many names for ourselves and why that's important.
Amazing, thank you. That is, yeah, that's excellent. I'm going to listen right after this. And May, did you have any other thoughts about code switching?
Not really. I mean, I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, so I'm a hillbilly. So I had to code switch to be a professional. Okay, so if you want to call it code switching, I call it effective communication. So I think of it as a positive thing.
Right. So it sounds like everybody has had some experience with that. I did have another question about how do we approach meeting a person where they are at if they're in a place or holding a perspective that is rooted in white supremacy? And I feel like maybe the implication is also that they may not know that. Maybe they do. Um, Alyssa, you look like you had some thoughts out of the gate. You have anything to share?
Out of myself. Lord have mercy, yes. How I do it is coming into that conversation or that space with the understanding is that person is operating with the knowledge they have, and coming to it with the understanding that, you know, you are not coming into that, you're not talking to them to convert them or to change their mind, because, and something that I have to remind myself and recognize every single day, every moment of the day, is that sometimes there are just not people that will not agree with you. They don't want to hear what you're saying. You are not going to reach them. You are not the voice that is going to, like, if you explain it this way or you point out that, sometimes that don't work. And that is because that person has to be willing to hear you. And sometimes people aren't at that stage yet. Sometimes they're at that stage of, no, I'm holding, this thing is precious to me and it has been passed down from my great, 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 great uncle, dang it. And I'm going to hold on to it, even though it's like literally burning their hand. And you're like, please give me the thing. Sometimes you just got to let people walk their own path and take their own clothes and burn their own hands. And then after they burn their own hands and they recognize, oh, this is the thing that's causing me pain, then maybe they'll chuck it and you can have that conversation. So, and it's tough. So recognizing who is actually ready to have that conversation, who is ready to listen, who's ready to take that next step, and who ain't, you know, because you need to conserve your energy. I recognize that my talent is not coming into situations of grace. I am a sharpshooter. I am like, this is what it is. This is what we need to do. No further questions. Let's go. Sometimes that ain't the way to handle situations. And so I need to be cognizant and work on who's ready for that next step. Who's ready for that 202, that 302? Because that's where I'm at and that's where I can invest my energy. So that is what I offer to you, is learn the difference between people who are ready to listen and somebody who's still in that stage of, I'm still needing to let go of this thing burning my own hand. Because the last thing you want to do is spend all of your energy on this person that ain't gonna listen to you, and leaving out the people that are like looking at the situation being like, I'm ready to listen, speak to me. I'm ready for 202. You know, you got to make sure that your own prerequisites straight too.
I think that is a really fantastic note to wrap this up on. I want to thank you folks so much. This has been a really great conversation, and I am, yeah, just thrilled that I got to talk to you all, and I guess a lot of other people did too. So that's my lucky day. I'm going to just share the screen that has the little survey on it and where you can donate. And yeah, thank you again. Again, panelists, if you didn't, or not, sorry, panelists, you can too if you want, but our viewers, if you did not get your question answered, please pass it on to us in the form that comes through. And we also have those questions on hand, and you know, we'll try to get you guys some answers as best we can. Thank you again so much to everyone who was here and to who gave us your time. Thank you so much. I'm going to put the slide up and bid adieu to you all.
Yeah, I just want to thank May and Alyssa for saying yes to being here today and sharing your knowledge, experience, and expertise. Um, right now, we're just waiting for folks to kind of trickle out and share or scan the stuff for the feedback form and donate if they want to. Um, and yeah, thank you all so much. And I'm just waiting for people to. I want to share some more stuff with you all, but I'll wait for folks to be out of the meeting.